Hey y'all, my name's Olson Logan. Today I'm going to be talking about oligopoly and its relation to microeconomics. Oligopoly is one of the four major market structures that are studied in microeconomics. It refers to a market that is dominated by just a few major firms. Since there are so few competitors, each firm's decisions carry substantial weight. In other words, if one firm raises or cuts its price or introduces or stops making something, other firms usually respond. In oligopoly markets, barriers to entry are typically high, such as large startup costs, strong brand loyalty, or government regulations that make it hard to enter the market, thereby giving existing firms greater control. Before exploring oligopoly in depth, it is useful to view a comparison graph of all four market structures to see where oligopoly sits in the bigger picture. This graph compares perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. The shapes of the demand and marginal revenue curves differ for each market structure. For oligopoly, the demand curve slopes downward, but does so in a less clear manner than monopoly. Oligopolies do have some pricing power, but cannot behave like a full monopoly because rival firms continue to exist. This graph helps illustrate that oligopoly falls between competitive markets and pure monopoly. Pricing behavior in oligopoly becomes more complex, and this is where the kinked demand curve model is useful. The model is used by economists to explain why price in oligopoly markets tend to remain stable. Here's the first version of this model. This graph reveals that the demand curve has two different slopes. The top segment is elastic. If a firm raises its price, consumers are likely to switch quickly to competing firms, and quantity demanded falls sharply. If a firm lowers its price, however, competitors are likely to meet the price cut, and the firm gains very little in the form of extra demand. The lower segment is inelastic. The kink between these two segments creates a noticeable gap in the marginal revenue curve, the bend shown in the graph. Because of this gap, even if marginal costs shift slightly, the profit maximizing price and quantity remain unchanged. And this accounts for the rigidity of the oligopoly pricing, as you can see on the graph. A second version of the kinked demand curve makes these points even clearer. This graph shows that demand is elastic This graph shows that demand is elastic when price rises and inelastic when price falls. Moreover, it contains two different marginal cost curves, MC1 and MC2, that pass through the gap in the marginal revenue curve with no effect on the equilibrium price P1 or quantity Q1. This illustrates the key implication of the kinked demand curve model. Firms have little incentive to change prices. If a firm raises prices, it will lose customers. If it lowers prices, it risks starting a price war with competing firms. For all these reasons, the price that emerges in oligopoly usually lies between the perfect competition and monopoly prices. Oligopolistic firms compete mainly through advertising, product differentiation, and quality improved, but avoid cutting prices. The output level also falls between the competitive and monopoly quantities. Efficiency results could be quite varied in oligopolies. When firms truly compete, such as through innovation or improvements in production, consumers may benefit. However, when firms collude or coordinate in order to keep prices artificially high, consumer welfare suffers, and the market begins to take on characteristics of a monopoly. Collusion and price fixing are illegal, yet they have occurred in industries such as airlines, technology components, and automobile parts. What makes oligopoly especially important is that just a few firms determine the entire market, and each firm's behavior takes into account the expected behavior of others. The kinked demand curve and the discontinuity in the marginal revenue curve help to illustrate visually why price changes are so rare under this structure. Oligopoly represents a middle ground between competition and monopoly, and depending on how the firms behave, the results might be beneficial to consumers or result in higher prices. Thank you. That's all I got.